There we go. Thanks for recording. So my name is Leya Charles. I am the Impaired Waters List Coordinator for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And if you are here to talk about the Triennial Standards review of Minnesota's water quality standards, you are in the right place. I am joined here today by my co-presenter, Lyle. I'll let her introduce herself as well.
Yes, hi, I'm Lyle. I am in the Water Quality Standards Unit as a research scientist, and I work on a variety of water quality standards projects.
Awesome. So we're going to take the next about 25-30 minutes here today, go through some background on what is the Triennial Standards Review, what are water quality standards, what do we actually have in our work plan right now for you guys to discuss. And then we have, as Hannah mentioned, an hour at the end to have some question answers and discussion. So first off, let's talk about what is a water quality standard. Well, a water quality standard is a number or narrative statement that is used to protect a water body for a specific beneficial use. And we'll talk about in a moment what is the beneficial use. But yeah, first and foremost, it is that tool under the Clean Water Act to restore and maintain and protect water quality, right? Certain beneficial uses like swimming, as you see here on this slideshow. That looks like a lovely summer day, much warmer than it is today. Doing some swimming. Swimming would be an example of a beneficial use. So yeah, again, a water quality standard is that number or that narrative statement. And a beneficial use, you might also hear state staff say designated use. Same thing. We designate those beneficial uses in Minnesota rule for different classes. So that's a lot of terms. Let's go through what that means. So over on the right-hand side, you see that column of 7 different beneficial uses, right? And class 1, number 1, for drinking water, you might hear people reference classes. Those are assigning those beneficial uses. So we want to be able to use a water body for drinking. We want to be able to protect a water body for aquatic life, for all those critters, those fish, those bugs that are in that water body, in that lake, in that stream. We want to be able to protect it for aquatic recreation, right? To be able to swim in it, to be able to fish in it. And important to note that just about every water body in the state has multiple beneficial uses assigned to it, right? Because we want to be able to protect all of the aquatic life that's in a water body, as well as be able to protect it for human uses as well, like recreation or like drinking water or agriculture or whatnot. So there are 7 different beneficial uses that we have designated in Minnesota rules, and that's what's listed there. And so we organize those standards accordingly. So we have different standards to protect different uses, right? So let's go through a scenario just to get everyone on the same page here. You would have a different standard, a different numerical standard for chloride than you would have a different numerical standard for protecting aquatic life, right? Protecting for drinking water, you don't want your water to taste salty, but also chloride is harmful to the fish that live in those water bodies. And so when you have a scenario like this, where you have a water body with multiple use classes assigned, we are always going to pick that most stringent standard that applies. So here that would be that aquatic life standard of 230 milligrams per liter. And so that is the standard that we would use, say, in my day-to-day work on the impaired waters list. We would use that for water quality assessments to determine if it's impaired or not. You're always using that most stringent standard that applies when you have multiple use classes that apply. Okay, we're almost done with a little bit of the background here, but it's important to note the difference between a standard and a limit, because that applies to some of the triennial review. So the standard is that water quality goal that you want for that whole water body, for that whole lake, for that whole stream. It is that number or that narrative that applies to all of that. And related but different is a limit, right? So that limit is what is written in a permit, that effluent limit, and that applies to something end of pipe, so to speak. So it's the actual discharge water that's then going into that water body, gets kind of diluted out in the lake and the stream and whatnot. And so there's different numbers for limit versus a standard. So they're related, absolutely, but they are different. So sometimes when you look in a permit, you might see a different number than the standard and wonder why. That's why. Okay, so that's some beginner stuff for folks. Now let's actually talk about what we're here to talk about, the Triennial Standards Review. So what is it? Well, it is an opportunity for the public to comment on Minnesota water quality standards. It is a requirement from the Clean Water Act, from the federal government, from the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, for states or tribal nations with treatment as a state to look every 3 years, right, triennial, to review all the water quality standards on the books to see, are there new standards that we need to protect water quality? Is the number that we have on the books, say for chloride, is that the right number? Do we need to revise that with recent science? Things like that. So just kind of a comprehensive review is what the Triennial Standards Review is. And it's a really cool thing in the sense that the public is able to comment on a breadth of water quality standards, right? A lot of opportunities that you have in a water quality standards rulemaking, you're only commenting on one specific standard. But in the Triennial Standards, you can comment on a lot. And we'll go through what all of that covers in a moment. So we are here at the second of our public meetings. The first recording is going to be posted online, and you can also review that if you wish. As Hannah mentioned at the beginning, this is also being recorded. And these are the two public meeting opportunities. But if you have any other questions, you can always contact those of us, myself, Laura, to ask offline as well. And our public comment period started December 9, and it goes through February 7, right? So you want to get those public comments in at midnight by February 7 to have that in the record. And we'll go through at the end how to actually public comment. So as I mentioned, here is our timeline. Triennial is for 3 years. So we're here in that purple box in that public comment period. So as the timeline goes, we've got the public comment period. As the public comment period ends, February 7, we will be taking in as an agency all of those public comments, reviewing those comments, reprioritizing as needed our work plan, which we're going to talk about next. And then that work plan gets submitted to the EPA for them to approve, and then goes on to the next 3 years of the actual technical development of the standards, the actual rulemaking and promulgation of those standards. And in those next 3 years, for the items that will be happening, for the water quality standards that will be going into rulemaking for the next 3 years, you will have another opportunity to comment on those standards, right, in those rulemaking. So this is very early on in that engagement. So let's actually talk about what's open for review, right? I mentioned there is a breadth that is open. So we've first off got our draft work plan for our triennial standards. So this work plan is posted on our Triennial Standards Review webpage. And it's also in that public comment notice for you to review and link as well on the Gov delivery. And this is basically the agency's goals for the next 3 years and for years after that as well. And in a moment, we're going to walk through actually all the details of what's on that work plan. But it is our plan of what we think we can accomplish, what we have prioritized. And we want to know what the public thinks. What do you think? Are there other standards that should be prioritized differently? Are there standards that are missing on the work plan that really should be elevated, that we need to be tackling? That sort of thing. So we've got that work plan so that you can see what our priorities are. And then we've got the Minnesota Rule 7050, which governs all the waters in the state, right? State law for that. And then Minnesota Rule 7052, which is for the Lake Superior Basin. So those have contained all of the water quality standards throughout the state in those two rule chapters. So you can comment on any of those rules, not just the things that we have on the work plan. You can also comment on variances. So like we mentioned before with those limits, you can comment on any active variances that are out right now. Okay, so we would love to hear from folks about the water quality standards work plan. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she's going to go through each of these groups, what those groups mean, and what's actually on the work plan for you guys, so you can interpret it a little better.
Great, thanks, Leya. So I'm just going to walk through quickly a brief description on kind of how we have laid out our work plan into different groups. We're looking, so our proposed work plan lays out our water quality standards that are both in progress and those that haven't yet begun, but that we see as a priority. And so our priorities were based on kind of the degree of need that we saw for the standard, whether we had new data or science, any impacts or benefits that we might see from developing those standards as compared to something else, any public comments, and especially staff resources and expertise. So some of these may not be able to be developed concurrently because our expert is working on one versus the other. So we've broken our work plan down into 3 different groups. The first group is what we are calling kind of current and active, group 1. And so this first group is standards that we're currently working on, obviously. So some of these projects are in initial rulemaking, so they may have already had a public comment period. They may have a technical support document already posted. And so these are our highest priorities. We're currently active on them, and we're working on getting them out the door and through rulemaking. So our second group of standards are those that are in early development. We're working on some of the technical issues. So they're high priority, but the work done isn't as far along as those that are in group 1. And so they likely won't enter rulemaking in the next year or so, but they may have moved by the end of the triennial period. The third group is what we're calling tracking and evaluation. We still see these as important needs, but they're lower priority as compared to these other 2 groups. And they may be lacking, data review or a full data set, or maybe we don't have staff time available at this moment, but we still want to highlight them as important needs for future work. So first off, I'm going to go through all of the different projects in group 1, which again are things that we're currently working on. So the first thing on here are the revisions to our lake eutrophication standard. And so this project is going to add new standards to address eutrophication for some northern shallow lakes, and also broaden applications to existing standards for other cold water lakes. So this project is going to review lake designations and adopt the tiered aquatic use framework, which we've been applying throughout the years here after that was developed, to lakes. And so this rulemaking has undergone public comment already, and we expect to finalize this rulemaking in this calendar year. And then also related to eutrophication, we're developing a site-specific standard for Red Lake, where the PCA is working alongside the Red Lake Nation to address some of the unique conditions that are in Red Lake. These site-specific standards have already also received public comment, and those comments are being addressed before we send to EPA for finalization. Next on our list is the Class 2A, 2B modifications. And so this is where we've been adopting our TALU framework for the past few years. We've been kind of just doing this in batches. This is our third revision here. Last triennial period, we also had this same thing in group 1, but that project was actually completed. It's moved on, and this is actually just the third of those revisions. So you might think that it wasn't completed, but it was. This is just a new set. Next is another ongoing project that we've been working on, is updating and improving our Class 1 standards. Leya mentioned those earlier. Those are our drinking water standards, where we're protecting sources of drinking water. This isn't what's coming out of your tap. We don't regulate that. The Department of Health is in charge of developing values to protect the actual tap water. So our jurisdiction is the sources of those waters. So, lakes, groundwater, rivers. So that project is going to update science and methodology and add new water quality standards for pollutants that don't have water quality standards under the current Class 1 standards. And then next up, we have a couple nitrogen-related projects. So both of these are for the protection of aquatic life. The first is ammonia, and this would be revising our current ammonia standard with new updated science. And then for nitrate, this would actually be developing a brand new water quality standard to protect nitrate for aquatic life. And these projects have been priorities for several years. Both have draft technical support documents up. And so because of that, these two projects have moved from group 2 into group 1 since our last triennial review. So our second group of projects is group 2, which again is our technical development group. The first project we have on there is a new addition to our work plan, which is the development of aquatic life standards for PFOS and PFOA. These are two PFAS chemicals that the EPA has recently published aquatic life criteria for. And so we would like to adopt these criteria to ensure protection of aquatic life from these two very prevalent PFAS compounds. Also related to PFAS, we are planning to develop a fish tissue standard for PFOS. So this would not be a water value. This would be a limit in fish tissue that you would need, that the waters would need to meet. So to date, we have at the agency worked on some site-specific criteria for PFOS in fish tissue that apply to various water bodies in the metro area. But given the wide detection of PFOS across the state, we anticipate needing to develop a statewide water quality standard to protect human health for people consuming those fish. Next on the list, we have clothianidin and imidacloprid. These are two pesticides that Minnesota's Department of Ag named as pesticides of concern in 2020. And that was due to the detection of these chemicals across the state at levels that exceed EPA's benchmarks. So EPA develops benchmarks to kind of assess whether a certain concentration would cause impacts to aquatic life. And so we have seen exceedances of these chemicals across the state. So we see that that's important to start developing standards to ensure aquatic life is protected. Next on the list, we have a revision to our dissolved oxygen standard to protect aquatic life. So dissolved oxygen, we already have a standard on the books, but we do see instances where there are naturally low dissolved oxygen concentrations, but we still see good aquatic life. This happens in areas like downstream of wetlands, which have lower DO. Some regions of the state just have different concentrations, and different stream gradients also can vary the dissolved oxygen. And so we would like to revise our standards to help address these naturally occurring situations. Similar to that, we also would like to revise our total suspended solids concentrations or standards to address aquatic life, where we have waters that are naturally high in TSS, but we still see high quality biological systems. And so we see these conditions in north central Minnesota in the glacial lakes and in the Rainy River Basin in northern Minnesota. And so we'll enter in a situation where we would have the need to assess these for the impaired waters list as being impaired, even though there's good biology, just based on our total suspended solids standard. So we'd like to address this. And lastly, for group 2, we have aluminum and copper for aquatic life. And so both of these metals have updated EPA criteria. And so that's based on new updated science. And so we would like to incorporate this new science into our standards to better protect aquatic life. And lastly, we have group 3, which again, this is where we're kind of tracking and evaluating kind of where we're at on developing these standards. The first project there is a site-specific standard for sulfate in the lower Mississippi River to protect for wild rice. So we've seen in the lower Mississippi that there's been increased wild rice growth, even with sulfate exceeding our current standard of 10 milligrams per liter. And so we're looking into determining whether the wild rice beneficial use is being met in that stretch at those ambient sulfate levels. And if so, potentially developing a site-specific standard that still protects the beneficial use, but recognizing the unique environmental situation that's happening there. Next, we've got mercury in fish tissue to protect human health. Again, this is another like PFOS. This is another tissue-based standard. We currently do have a mercury standard for fish tissue, but there's new science available. And so we're looking into, getting a review done of that new science to kind of determine our approach for a revision. Next on there, if you've kept up with triennials in the past, you'll see chloride and sulfate. They've been on our triennial for a few years. We have in this cycle moved them to group 3. The EPA has been working on developing an ion model that includes chloride and sulfate. So there's been more research done to show that these different ions, when they're in mixtures, they interact with each other to either ameliorate or add to the toxicity of another ion. And so the EPA is working on developing this model that would better help us characterize the toxicity of chloride and sulfate in context of the other ions. And so we've been told by EPA that they were going to get this draft document out in 2025. And so that would be draft. And so we anticipate that the final would come later. And so at this point, we're just going to wait on EPA's documentation so that we can have the best science available before we were to develop new standards for chloride and sulfate. And then last there on the list, we have cadmium. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping. We have cyanotoxins, which are, we've seen algal blooms in lakes in Minnesota waters kind of increasing in frequency in recent years. And so there are toxins associated with these algal blooms that can impact recreation uses, even when our nutrient standards are not exceeded. So EPA has developed criteria for a couple cyanotoxins that we want to look into adopting so that we can assess water bodies that may have algal blooms where the nutrient standards aren't exceeded, but we want to ensure that recreation is still a beneficial use that is safe. So we want to make sure that we're protecting against elevated levels of those cyanotoxins that can make people ill. And lastly, we have cadmium for aquatic life protection. EPA had an updated criteria for cadmium, and we were anticipating adopting it based on that updated science. But in the past few years, EPA has decided to reevaluate that criteria. So we've stuck it in group 3. We still see it as important, but we don't want to move on it until EPA has reassessed their work before we were to go down that road, just to make sure that we're using any sort of best available science that they may evaluate in their reevaluation. So that is our draft work plan that we would like input on from you for the next 3 years. And I'm going to turn it back over to Leya to discuss how to make a public comment and wrap up the presentation.
Thanks, Laura. Oof, it's a lot, lots of good work. So let's talk about how to actually make a comment about all of this good work, right? So to recap, these are the materials that you can comment on in the Triennial Standards Review, right? We've got that draft work plan that Laura just went through, those standards that are in group 1 that are going to be completed within the next 3 years, and then those other standards in group 2 and 3 that we're going to keep chipping away at. You've got anything on as a standard or site-specific standard that is in Minnesota Rules 7050 and 7052, and then you've got any active variances that have been issued. So how to actually public comment? Well, if you are a person who loves to do things on your phone, you can scan that QR code and it'll take you to the public comment page. We're also going to link in the chat, or you can just Google MPCA, Triennial Standards Review. You'll find that webpage pops up. When you scroll down in the webpage, there's a blue button that says Provide Feedback. And when you click on that, it'll pop open a new tab in your browser for smart comments. And that's the system we use to help get all those comments in and help track those and make sure we can respond to them. So you can type straight in the smart comments box, or you can attach a link if you have a PDF or a Word letter. If you have some more data to share with us, that is super helpful. We definitely encourage submitting written comments for any comments that you would provide here today orally. And I also really encourage you to link sources, to link data, to be really specific in the types of things that you would want us to prioritize, the types of standards and parameters that you think we need to work on. That's really helpful for us. So this is the last slide I have for you on what's next, reviewing our timeline here. This is the last of the 2 public meetings. And then we have the end of the public comment period is February 7 at midnight. So that button on the website stays active until then. So you have until February 7 at midnight to get those public comments in. Then we're going to take some time as an agency to review and respond to the public feedback, to make any shifts or updates that we need to on that draft work plan. And then we will submit that to EPA for their approval. So that is the background information we have for you on standards, the background information we have for you, and some of those details on the work plan. We would really love to hear from you now. And I am going to turn it over to my supervisor, Bill Cole, and he will help facilitate and answer those questions. So Wopida.
Great. Thank you, Leya and Laura. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's really nice to see some interest in the work that we do. So this is the time for you to provide your thoughts on if we need any new standards, if there's any current standards that need revision, any comments on our draft work plan. Are we addressing the right standards? Do we have our priorities straight in your mind? I would encourage you, if you do provide public comment today verbally, which we look forward to also submit written comments. It's very helpful for us. And if you do provide comments verbally today, I would just ask that you identify yourself. That would be helpful. Online today, besides Laura and Leya, are other scientists that work on the development of water quality standards, and they may help out in providing some clarification or answering some questions. With that, I think I'll open it up for questions. And I do see one right away from Gary, who asked, what are you doing to do regarding drinking water standards for nitrate? So thanks, Gary. This is part of our Class 1 rulemaking. So Department of Health has authority to regulate water that essentially comes out of the tap, where we at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency under the Clean Water Act have the authority to regulate the sources of drinking water. And that's one of the things that we're doing in our Class 1 revisions. And right now, how our rules are written is that we incorporate federal drinking water standards by reference. Now, a lot of those federal drinking water standards are fairly old. They haven't been updated for quite some time. And we now want to have the ability to either replace those federal drinking water standards or have new standards based on more recent science. We're looking at perhaps adopting an additional 100 standards or so a lot of standards for our sources of drinking water. Nitrate, if you have information and feel strongly about a revision to the nitrate standard, I would encourage you to express that. So thank you, Gary. So another question from Kelly. It's a little bit longer one. I'm going to read it if that's okay, just to make sure that we get it captured on audio. So Kelly says, similar to areas that may have naturally low DO or TSS, while still maintaining aquatic life value, the Vermilion River has a unique situation where it is designated as a 2A stream, 2A being a cold water stream, due to brown trout populations. However, following the TALU framework to score the biological integrity, the stream reaches are automatically docked points relating to native taxa criteria as brown trout and are not not a native species, sorry. Can this discrepancy be incorporated into your review? South Washington WD Watershed District has a like situation. This is perhaps, I'm hoping Will might be able to weigh in on this. Will is our TALU expert. And if he's not available, I can give it a shot.
I could chip in on this. The Vermilion is a river that we're aware of, and we've had a lot of conversations with the watershed district and trying to make sure we assign the right standards for it. And it's a tricky one because it is somewhat unique. It's not just like a lot of our other cold water streams, which are either in the southeast or northeast part of the state. So it is somewhat different. We're not sure if it ever supported native brook trout, but it does support a nice population of brown trout, and we want to make sure we protect that. So I guess the long story short is we're keeping an eye on this one. We know there are issues, water quality issues relating to habitat and sediment within the Vermilion, and there's work to continue to improve that. But at this time, we don't know exactly what the goal should be for that. And so it's basically the objective is to keep looking at it, keep making improvements. At some point, there may be a determination that the river is doing sufficiently well to be considered meeting aquatic life goals, even if it's not meeting our statewide goals. But it's a situation where we need to collect additional data and to also work on fixing some of the problems that we know the watershed has.
Hi, Will. Kelly Perrine here. So I'm with the Vermilion River Watershed.
Okay.
I was in Travis Teal. I'm in Travis Teal's old position as he is our now administrator.
Yeah.
So yeah, I understand that you have been working with us for quite some time to address this very specific concern. I will say that in terms of relating it to South Washington Watershed District, I believe it's Browns Creek that has a similar issue where they have brown trout and they're automatically, kind of knocked those points in the native taxa area. And so we appreciate your partnership in trying to kind of work with us for this unique situation. And just in hearing the presentation, it just kind of strikes a chord in hearing that, there are various areas across the state where if there's those naturally lower DO concentrations, the standard might shift a bit to meet that unique situation, as well as, naturally high TSS concentrations as well. So yeah, we will be submitting the public comment as well through your platform, but I figured I'd bring it up here and appreciate you assigning some narrative to it as well.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate your comments. The water quality standards is always, work to try to make sure we're assigning the right standards. And in some cases, that means making refinements. And unfortunately, sometimes that also means we have sufficient amount of data to make a determination of what those standards should be in order to ensure that we're not just assigning numbers or goals that are not going to be sufficiently protective. And so that's where we are, I think, with the Vermilion is we'd like to have more data to make sure we can set the right goal and not, undercut the potential for the system. So, but we appreciate it.
Yeah, and I believe so. I think it started in 2010 was the first year it started. but watershed staff began implementing a biological monitoring plan. And so we have been conducting over the past, 10 plus years, getting data on, various IBI scoring, fish sampling, and I believe we've been coordinating with Jordan Donatel, I think his last name is, to share all of that data. So in terms of providing data, just let us know if you have that data readily accessible and how we can continue to assist in that.
Okay, yeah, we really appreciate it. So yeah, thanks for commenting.
Thanks, Will, for weighing in. That you articulated that much better than I ever could. And thanks, Kelly, for the question. Next, there is a question from Jean's iPad. And Jean's iPad says, you have 2 neonics for aquatic life in your group 2. Are they part of your health standards in group 1? And if I understand your question correctly, Jean, I think that they're different. The health standards in group 1, I believe what you're asking about is our class 1 standards for sources of domestic consumption. You could provide some additional questions around that or clarification. Hopefully I answered your question there, but any follow-up would be great. Next question is from Abby Parker, and Abby says, in regards to ammonia and nitrate standards you have mentioned in group 1, would this apply to surface water monitoring for both lakes and rivers? I believe so. I mean, once we have standards on the book, if we have the capacity in our monitoring program, we would look at monitoring ammonia and nitrate. Next question from Stephen Ring. Could you please address non-point source issue? The non-point source issue. I pass, where you would pass nitrate, aquatic life. Do you have any capacity to regulate agricultural sources of nitrate? Or will the whole burden fall on wastewater treatment plants? So great question, Stephen. And this is one of the challenging part of our work. This is getting a little bit beyond the scope of the meeting of new or revised standards, but under the Clean Water Act, we are limited in some regards on how we can regulate some types of agricultural activities, such as irrigation return water, for example. So I hate to say that, but I mean, in some senses, our hands are tied in that regard unless there's some changes made at a higher level. And I get the burden that's placed on the wastewater treatment plants. Next question from Trevor Russell. Within group 1, current and active, the first 2 items have an estimated finalization date. The MPCA in a position to provide estimates for completion of the other standards in that group? I can talk to that a little bit. Another one is that's in group 1 is the Red Lake eutrophication site-specific standards. We are very, very close to getting that out the door. That's another project that Will Bouchard is working on. So I would say that we would hope to submit that to EPA yet this month. As far as the others in that group, I don't have a specific timeline. Part of that has to do with the triennial, right? I mean, until we have finalized our work plan and know what our priorities are, I'm a little bit hesitant of providing those timelines. I don't want to be misleading. Yep, thank you, Trevor. Next question is from Christy Kearney. And the question is, northern Minnesota is naturally high in aluminum in groundwater and surface waters. How will this be considered in the evaluation of the aluminum standard? Not sure entirely. I guess there's a couple of things here. One is that we do have provisions in our rule to address natural background, and where natural background conditions are higher than our standard, then those natural conditions become our standard. And that's the tricky part there is determining what natural background is. So I don't want to make that sound too easy. The second part is that I think that the new federal recommended criteria in many cases will become less stringent than what we have on the books right now, and yet the beneficial use will still be protected. Whether that's the case in this situation or not, I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure that response isn't 100% satisfactory, but we can look into that in more detail in our written responses. So Jean is rephrasing the question. What is your plan for protecting drinking water sources for neonics? As far as I know right now, I'm not sure if we're looking at that in class 1 or not. I might, if it's okay, defer to Laura, who's our lead. That's Laura.
Yes, hi, Jean. Sorry, I was trying to succinctly type you a chat message. From what I understand from your question, are we including those two chemicals in our class 1 revisions? And so the answer is likely. We don't have a full defined list yet, but those two chemicals are on our draft list because they do have updated science, human health values for drinking water. So there's a good chance that they will wind up in our revisions. I'm not going to promise, but it's in our draft list. Yes.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, Jean. Any other questions? We have till 12:30, so we could be here for a while. Another question from Stephen Ring. Are you considering using some kind of total fluoride measurement to screen for PFAS compounds? That's a little bit beyond my knowledge. We can either respond to that in writing, or if anybody from the standards unit has a thought on that, they could jump in. Thank you, Stephen.
I can jump in. I don't think that's anything that we're planning on doing with our current standard, with our standards that we're planning on working on right now. I don't think that's a current idea of what we're going to be working on with our PFAS standards. It's something that we're aware of out there, but with the current PFAS standards that we're planning on working on, no, that's not something that we're considering.
We have another question from Christine Kearney. do you have an understanding of when EPA will be issuing their draft criteria on chloride, sulfate, other ion interaction? Thank you, Christine. My understanding is that EPA plans on having draft criteria out by the end of this year for peer review. And we're just waiting to see if that pans out. So that's the current plan. Question from Gary. Do you have standards for nitrates in wetlands? Currently, we do not have standards for nitrates in wetlands. We are, on our work plan, we are planning to develop nitrates to protect nitrate standard to protect aquatic life. And that would be for all waters of the state. And that would include wetlands. Thank you, Gary. A few more questions here. From Trevor Russell. Looking back at the last triennial work plan, how well did the agency's work plan align with the actual outcomes? Any lessons learned from the last process that informed your approach this time? That's an interesting question. I think always, with standards work, it's slow, arduous work, and I know that sounds like an excuse. But it does take time to develop water quality standards, and sometimes new priorities come up. There is a lot of work going on behind the scenes in developing standards. Sometimes standards might take 10 years to develop. That's not unheard of. Any lessons learned? I think we're always learning lessons, right? I think that, having good public engagement, I think is something that we all can always improve on. For example, that's why we have 2 public meetings, one during the evening, one during the day. Any suggestions that you have in that regard, Trevor, would be much appreciated. A question from Gary Dukes. Who do we talk to for non-point agricultural pollution? I think perhaps people in our watershed division, they work more closely with local partners. I don't have specific names for you right now. Also, Bowser is a good source of information for non-point pollution as well. And then Christine Kearney asks, can you provide any additional details on a proposed revision to the mercury standard in fish tissue, or what the latest research shows? I'm not sure if I can do that right off the bat, and that's something that we could provide in writing, unless someone else from the unit wants to weigh in on that one.
Yeah, Christy, I think we'll mostly have to get back to you. I just know that there's updated values. And that's why it's in group 3 right now, is we want to just kind of dig into that information. And right now we don't have someone that's working on it. So that's why it's in group 3. We just need to do a little more looking into how we might want to approach it, what's out there. But we do know that it's important. Sorry, that's not super satisfying, but we can look more into it and get back to you in our responses to comment if you'd like.
So Jean has a comment question. You said standards might take 10 years, but you have been working on the nitrate standard for 15 years and haven't committed to finishing it. Why not? That's a great question. I think part of it has to do with timing. I know that on our work plan, the development of nitrate standard has moved up in our priority list and has moved to group 1, and it is a high priority for us. Another question from CYT 1030. Do you have any idea of what the nitrate standard might be at this time for protection of aquatic life? Oh, that's Tom Moe. Thanks, Tom. I might let Phil speak to this. However, we haven't published the request for comments yet on this, so having a solid number that we can articulate might not be prudent for us. But Phil, if you want to weigh in, if you're online, on numbers that we might be thinking.
Yeah, hi, Phil Munson, MPCA. Right now, what we have in our draft technical support document for Class 2B waters is a value of 8 milligrams per liter. And as Bill said, there's revision to be done to the technical support document, which could change that number. But based on available science and calculation, that's where we're at for that right now.
Thank you, Phil. Question from Kelly. With new EPA PFAS and PFOA guidelines and the MPCA incorporating them into areas such as fish tissue, will MPCA include PFAS and PFOA monitoring with their 10-year monitoring plans? Will this include monitoring in water as well as fish tissue? We are looking at how we will address monitoring, but we don't have any specific plans right now. I don't know, Laura, if you want to weigh in on this, or maybe that's sufficient.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Yep. So we're evaluating that. Thank you, Kelly. Question from Henry Stelton. With respect to the sulfate site-specific standard development for the lower Mississippi River, is the current idea that the agency will look at this reach of the river as a whole or by conditions for each pool? I'm going to let Leya weigh in on this one, if that's okay, Leya. Leya's wears many different hats, and one of them is working on this site-specific standard.
Hi, Henry. Yeah, it's a great question. I know we've talked about what that approach actually looks like, and we're so early on in the process that we haven't really decided. Do we want to do everything from pools 4 down to 8 and use that as a whole chunk, or are we actually going to look at data on each individual pool? And I know that we were talking about having a meeting coming up here in February to actually kind of, look at some of that data together and kind of figure that out. But we don't know yet. We need to actually decide of how we want to approach the site-specific standard. then it would essentially be multiple site-specific standards, one for each pool, but that is an option.
These are great questions, by the way. Thanks for your insight. We'll give it a couple more minutes here if people think of anything new that they want to ask. I don't want us to be in a hurry here. There's a question about where is the recording posted? We will post the recording on our Triennial Standards Review webpage once that, and we can update that fairly soon. Thanks, Gary. I see the number of participants has dropped a little bit here. So any last questions? Another minute or so. Also know that before the end of the comment period, if you do have any questions, any clarifying questions as far as our plans, please let us know. Either Leya, Laura, or myself would be able to answer those. So just another minute or so. Right. Well, Hannah, I think we're gonna call it a wrap. For those of you still on, very much appreciate you being here. Very much appreciate your thoughts. Again, providing written comments would be very helpful to us as well. Thank you very much, and have a great day.